Some very cool new features have been added to the terrain editor, mostly involving layer painting and alphas. What I'm going to do is go ahead and add just a procedural terrain, and I'll go ahead and load in just a material. I'm going to go to landscapes. Actually, we'll go ahead and go to rocks and load in the gray rock to start out with. Now, because the material brush was the last I had selected when I opened the terrain editor, it immediately added a layer, the default rock, which we can remove if needed. You'll also notice that the color is basically showing as if the entire layer was painted, and that's because the alpha. In the upper right, you have the ability to preview the procedural layer, or anything connected to the alpha, or controlling the alpha presence. Now, because of the way that's set up, and because nothing has been painted, it is going to show that way in the editor. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Raise tool and delete that layer. And we're going to add in, from material layers, the grass layer. Click OK. And now when we switch to paint material, we're going to see that grass layer showing up with the alpha. Now I'm going to go ahead and increase the resolution of the terrain just to 512, and now that did not update the alpha. And you can see the pixels showing. So what we can do is click on the preview layer presence, which shows up down here in the farmost right of the layer. And we can right click on it, and that'll update the alpha. If we turn it on, it'll show these lines throughout the terrain, and the lines are basically where the alpha has no presence on the layer, unless of course you're going to be using the alpha as a mask. So there's different ways we can use these layers. Previewing the layer is really just a preview. It doesn't affect the painting at all. I am going to go ahead and modify the scale of that layer. Actually, we'll modify the default and set it to 1, and then set the grass layer to 1, and the gray rock we could set up to 10 in order to make it the size that it was when it was loaded in. And go back, and we can edit the object. Now there are a couple of ways we can use this layer information. One thing we could do is just use this alpha as sort of an cutout. So right next to the preview layer presence, we have the different layer options, and we can hide the layer. If we click it again, we get the freeze option. With the freeze option, now we can paint everything in those in-between areas. So we can use this to cut out and control the way we paint this way. Size that up a little bit and fill in these areas. So what this is doing is it's painting the layer, and it's also creating a mask for the procedural and the procedural alpha. If we click one more time beyond the freeze mask, we're going to get the alpha, and this is the procedural alpha. This is what's cutting out the procedural. And click it again, and we get the full layer preview. Go ahead and click OK. Now, if we just want those areas that we painted to show up, what we need to do is go into the material editor and take the alpha boost and bring it down to -100. And what that'll do is just show you that area that was painted and based on that mask. Now, typically, when you set the alpha boost down to 0, it would remove the presence of a material entirely. But a new output has been added, and you'll see connected to the layer painting node, and that's the environment attenuation. So that, along with the alpha, will connect to the layer painting, and the procedural information is passed to the environment attenuation, which is sort of an override for the alpha. So whenever we remove the alpha information with the alpha boost, whatever's passing through the procedural remains. And because we have a procedural mask that was painted, only that area is showing. So there's what the material looks like rendered out at the moment. Now another way we can use the alpha information in that preview layer, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that grass layer and add another one back in. So we have an unmodified material. And what we could do is we could choose to leave the alpha that is showing and just invert the brush when we're painting, and just cut out the areas that we don't want the material to show on. And then that's going to basically just subtract from the procedural. If we switch over to preview the alpha, we can see the painting we just made. So the main painted channel, if we take a look in the layer meta node, is completely white, which would be not showing at all, and then just the procedural mask shows up. Now, one thing I want to note about using the method I showed previously, and I'm going to go ahead and just reset the material. And mask it. I'll just paint. And then go back. If I set that to -100 to show just that painted masked area, and we can see that showing up. Now, if I turn off the preview for the transparency, it could remove that painted mask for the procedural. If we go into, take a look at the meta node, we can see the procedural mask is basically gone. So whenever you have that option turned off for the preview transparency, it will remove any painting that you've made on that layer. So it's a good idea to keep that option on. And if you do want to turn it off while you're in the terrain editor, if you're editing, working on something, just make sure you turn it back on before you close out the terrain editor. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove that layer, and I'm going to add a new layer. Use the large scale pale grass. We switch over, and we're just going to see that it's fully covering the terrain. I'm going to go to edit the material and go to the environment tab and change, only have it showing on flatter surfaces. And we could also adjust the altitude so it just shows towards the bottom. And now if we open up the terrain editor and we have that preview on, we'll be able to see those effects from the environment tab as well, which means we can also use those as a mask. This is useful for when you have a much higher resolution terrain, when the slope constraints built into the editor start to become a little sluggish because they're sampled at a much higher resolution than the terrain. So in this case, what we could do is fill this in. Make sure I turn off that slope constraint so it is more responsive. Just paint that in. Click OK. And now it's going to basically fully cover everything because I've just filled in the opposite areas. But what I can do is just remove all these constraints now in the environment tab, and then go into the alpha and just invert the brush paint layer. And now that extra processing won't need to be performed because now it's just painted in. And there you can see uh, those environment settings now brushed in. The material mask can also be used for any other sort of painting. If I wanted to raise up the grass layer, well, first I would need to invert the brush paint layer. I'm just going to turn off the transparency for the moment. We can freeze it. Go to the raise tool, airbrush, and I'm going to set the flow pretty low. And now we could just paint on those areas. That's going to be a little jagged, but you get the idea. I could always smooth that out. So then what I'd want to do is make sure I turn that transparency back on so we don't lose that information. And then we go back into the material and set it back. And it's pretty jagged because it's a kind of a low resolution. But you can see some of the things you can do with it. And of course, if we wanted to now paint on the rockier areas, we wouldn't really need to do anything except just freeze the mask as it normally is. And then we can modify the other areas.